Welcome to the podcast again, OG Rose, for the fourth or fifth time now.
Ethan Nelson, I always enjoy it very much. Thank you for having me, sir. It's a pleasure.
Awesome. Yeah. And I am absolutely stoked for this episode. I uh I didn't really prepare too much and I kind of just felt what wanted to emerge, and the topic of virtue felt very alive, feels very alive in the air, and I'm very excited to explore that space with you today.
I think that is a wonderful space to explore. I've had the pleasure of speaking with the great Matthew Allison recently on virtue, and I think that's a very important topic, but it is very difficult to discuss today because so many words are conflated together, like virtue, moral, ethical, good. Like there's something about language that has a tendency to kind of blur and conflate together. And
Mhm.
I think it was Rita Dove who kind of basically said, whenever a word dies, so also dies a thought. And so if these things all can play together, there are actually thoughts that are more difficult to have. And I think
Mhm.
virtue is a wonderful kind of ground zero for exploring thoughts that are hard to have now because terms have all been conflated together.
Yeah, absolutely. I would love to explore that with you as well. I notice myself not having super clear distinctions between all of these words, and myself, I feel I'm conflating them in some way. And so, yeah, it would be really great to explore the nuances of the distinctions between them. So I will start it off with, I've been sitting with the topic of virtue a lot lately. I've been running this 100-day program, and part of this program is reflecting on virtues and doing a daily 30-minute study period where we'll look at different cultures, specifically warrior cultures in the past, and reflect on what were the virtues that they were living by and orienting their life. There's been a few virtues that have really stood out, and as I've been like really reflecting on how do I install these in my life, it's becoming clear to me that it's not always self-evident what the best way is to live a virtuous life. And it feels like this very nuanced, personalized process. So some of the virtues that I've been really sitting with is courage, self-responsibility, discipline, service to others, loyalty, and um, I think those are the main ones. And yeah, it's really interesting to me how, yeah, just how do I live a virtuous life? Just this question in my mind of how do I live a virtuous life, and how do I let my life be guided by these virtues rather than hedonism or the easiest route, or things that lead me to a life that is not satisfactory in any way long term. And so I was going through some of your episodes, and there's a couple bullets here that I think can really kickstart us off and shoot us in the right direction. So you speak about how virtue is not externally imposed principles, but rather something that is cultivated within ourselves. But I also get the sense that it's not entirely not external. I get the sense that there's something we're orienting ourselves towards, but it's not like a forcefully imposing something onto our being, but rather noticing how the internal dimensions of our being can most properly orient towards them. And what I get the sense that though there's these unconditioned forms, maybe the true, the good, and the beautiful, we could call them, and in how I orient myself and my individual life context towards those is going to be much different than from how you individual orient your life towards them, and they're going to look very differently on the outside. And so what I get the sense of, or I'm wondering if this is how it lands for you, is that if someone were to like take a bird's eye view and not know either of us and be like, what is the similarities between these two people, it wouldn't be hard to distinguish where the virtue is, because our lives are so different and what we're doing on a day-to-day basis are so different. But the way that we're orienting ourselves towards those virtues, what does that process look like for you, and how does that really land?
Excellent. Well, as always, you always ask such great questions. And first off, I think there's one of the trickiest things is that life is so much about order, not either or. So it's not, is it the internal life or the external life? It's the which comes first. And if you get the wrong order, you end up in a lot of trouble. So if you say, oh, the internal life instead of the external, I don't need the external life, I just need the internal. Well, that's not going to work. You're going to end up isolated and maybe even like a narcissist or something. But if you say, oh, I don't need the internal life, I just need the external life, well, then you end up relying on external motivation, hedonism, consumerism, so on and so forth. But then if you say, oh, okay, well, I need both, but it's the external life first and then the internal life because I don't want to be like selfish or anything. Well, the problem is you get smothered. Your internal self just becomes a reflection of your external environment. And other pathologies that can develop as well. Like you can't set boundaries, like Dr. Cloud will talk about. Your identity is just part of your environment. It's not something that has its own definition that exists in concert with your environment. But if you say, well, the internal life to the external life, well, now we're starting to talk about what for me is the right order. And again, if we look back on classical thought, like Augustine, for example, he'll talk about evil, quote unquote, because he's asking, if God is good, how does evil exist? And he's saying, well, evil is a disordered good. There's nothing evil, nothing that exists has to be evil. If it becomes evil, it's disordered. So, for example, gluttony does not mean food is evil. It just means you have a disordered relation to evil. And I think one of the reasons why in life you require something like philosophy is because it is not self-evident the right order of things. Things do not tell you the order they should go in. You have to abstractly reason the order they should go in and then take a risk and then invest in. But you see, we've talked about it before, we've created a version of philosophy that is abstraction to abstraction because then it can avoid risk. You don't have to make a decision. You don't have to take responsibility for the order you place things in. You don't have to take any challenges. So philosophy is always tempted to stay in the realm of examination, not moving to the essence or the concrete, to use kind of Hegel or Humean terms. And that's where we've gotten into trouble. But if we think of philosophy first as an abstract reasoning of the proper ordering of things so that then we can have a risk, a practice, a investing in that order, then we see how philosophy prepares us for action. And indeed, I think if we're going to talk about virtue, what we're talking about is a way to cultivate or have certain internal resources so that when we act in the world, we contribute to its rightful ordering. We contribute to a higher probability of a life-giving outcome. We make better decisions. I know you've spoken with the great Forrest Landry. Virtue and decision-making is strongly tied together because the word virtue is really tied to vitality, and vitality being tied to life. And so virtue has something to do with living in a way that creates more life, that makes you more alive, that creates more life, and in turn, thus would be inspirational, you could even say. So one of the ideas actually of, say, why would lying be a vice? Well, because lying actually contributes to not living or being less alive. You go, whoa, why is that? Well, because when I tell a lie, then I have to maintain the lie. I have to always be aware that you don't find out the truth. I have to keep spanning the web, and often lies become lies upon lies upon lies. And quickly, I start existing in a state of paranoia, not childlike exuberance in a sort of Nietzsche way, right? Let's say I start getting into affairs or I'm lusting. Well, then I have to keep it secret, make sure nobody finds out. So what ends up happening is vice, you could put it this way. Virtue leads to vitality, where vice leads to, you could say, paranoia, anxiety, concealment, a life that's actually having to cover things, so on and so forth. Now, there's going to be some level of cultural conditioning to different virtues, right? Because some things that are acceptable in one culture would be not. But the constant factor, if you want to start talking about kind of a constant variable, is that virtue has something to do with increasing vitality, where vice has something to do with actually, making it difficult to get up in the morning because you're like, oh my gosh, how am I going to keep the lie going today? Oh my gosh, how am I going to keep my wife from knowing about my affair today? Oh my gosh, how am I going to keep the tax man from knowing about the money that I stole, and was hiding, right? So a way to look at it is that if you're living a virtuous life, you wake up with a feeling of, I can take on the world. I'm ready for the world. And in fact, I'm looking forward to taking on the world in a kind of taking on in a sort of exciting way, not in a fighting way. Whereas a viceful life is when you wake up in the morning and go, oh my gosh, everything's fragile. How am I going to keep this hidden? What am I going to do? Let's put it this way. Virtue is when you wake up and say, man, what am I going to do today? Where vice is when you wake up and go, oh my gosh, what am I going to do today? So the virtue is adding to the kind of inspiration, a feeling of capability, a feeling of I'm ready for, where vice has this feeling of at any moment it will break. everything will be there's a fragility. Well, let's use Nassim Taleb's, and then I'll give it back to you as the starting remarks. Virtue has something that increases anti-fragility in a sort of Nassim Taleb sense. And also, I've been doing a whole lot on Ivan Illich, who the more I read, I'm just convinced is a hyper genius, for this parallax class starting in November. And Ivan Illich is going to talk about the difference between capability and disablement. And what we have is virtue makes you feel capable, makes you feel excited, makes you feel intrinsically motivated, where vice leads to fragility. You're fragile in the Taleb way, you're disabled, and you're actually very nervous. And I think it's very important to see virtue and vice this way, because we're bringing then morality, virtue and vice is brought to an emotional felt experience, not just some abstract place of like dogmas and laws, right? That's one of the big problems we have. We think of virtue as, written on the 10 Commandments and we need to follow them just because it's good to follow them. They're not really linked to a motivational or an internal or an inspirational life. And so we're like, what's the point? We don't need them. But once you understand it has a lot to do with your motivation and capability in the day ahead, that completely transforms how you think about virtue and vice and why virtue is important. But then one of the reasons, and I'd be happy to elaborate on this, one of the reasons we don't understand virtue that way is because we've conflated virtue, if you give me some language, we've conflated virtue with basically morality. Morality is something that systems do. And all we need to do is be very good at utilitarian analysis. And if we can reduce poverty, that's the good thing to do. And so our only understanding of a moral compass is systems activity. And so we don't think about virtue in terms of individual vitality creation. And that's led to an outsourcing of the entire philosophy of virtue to systems that then are reducing poverty, which by all means, that's important. But this is where the conflation of language is so bad. Because if we think that virtue is just morality, well, morality equals what a system does. The most logical form of system analysis is utilitarianism. Therefore, the only ethical branch is utilitarianism. And then you as an individual start acting like you're not a person, but a system. And you're just looking around to increase basic metrics like, how do I reduce poverty? How do I increase access to clean water? And all of that is important, but then you're not actually training in your individual discernment and inner life to be good at virtue. And so you as an individual start acting like a system, which is a mismatch, where you just act like a robot that's interested in utilitarian analysis, which matters, but that's only one part of the whole equation. You also need the virtue, because virtue is the skills of a particular person, not a interchangeable individual with system analysis. So the loss of virtue has led to the overfitting of utilitarianism, which has turned all moral action into simply utilitarian analysis. And then we're not able to make good decisions, and we're not able to create inspiration, and we're not able to rightly order things, because that's not even a framework in our mind by which to live according to.
Fantastic. Yeah, I'm sensing this overlap between what you're saying and a sort of, I was listening to John Vervaeke and Greg Henrique's talk the other day, and they were talking about this thing called transcendent naturalism, which is essentially what is an overlap between science and spirituality. They're basically saying neither side is correct. The spiritual side is we're all one, everything is consciousness. The scientific side is overly reductionistic and saying what's real is only what can be measured. And I think that's where I saw the overlap is like, I'm getting the sense that when we conflate morality with virtue, then it's like the only good that there is to do is that which can be measured as a data statistic on the amount of clean water that I'm bringing, or the percentage reduction of poverty per capita of a city or something like that. And which obviously we need to do, but to say that that is the only marker of what is good feels like it makes I'm curious to hear where you go with this one. What it makes that which is not measurable less real, such as the relationship between two human beings and the feeling of connection between two human beings, and love and beauty and all of these things that don't have numbers, that don't have anything related to data or statistics to observe them. It's just this felt experience, this this more subjective or intersubjective experience of aliveness. And so I'm getting the sense that to be virtuous, we need to actually honor the experience of aliveness in my individual and intersubjective world, and actually sensing into that, but then also not discounting the objective in the data as well, but just seeing that my own aliveness can be in service of that, of but also yeah, but also it doesn't feel like the entire purpose of my subjective aliveness is to serve utilitarian ends. And so yeah, that's really interesting, and it's making me think of like, all right, if I want to live a virtuous life, my mind is trying to reduce, I'm noticing my mind trying to reduce things right now and say, does that mean all I have to do is track the amount of aliveness that I feel in any single moment and increase that, or do the things that increase aliveness and not the things that don't? Which I'm not sure if that's overly simplifying it, but I will say I deeply resonate with the aliveness comment, and I've noticed in myself, I've used the words like, yeah, when I lie, I'm increasing the degree of internal conflict that I feel within myself. And therefore, every lie that I add is like another part of myself that I'm like extracting. And then I become this fragmented being that has all of these different parts that are fighting with each other. And then I wake up and I'm like, God damn it, I have all of these parts that are at war with each other right now, and I'm just suffering. Whereas to be completely truthful, or as honest and truthful as I can in every single scenario, is like there's one whole being that's expressing honestly, and I'm not having to track fragmented identities that are at war with each other, but I'm just existing as this whole thing. So I'm curious how that lands.
Excellent. Always excellent, my dear friend. And it's kind of funny because we'll often in philosophy, go, oh, we can't be certain of anything. How do we know anything that's true? But I know I need to lie right now. We become it's very interesting how we, like, if you actually use the whole idea that you can't be certain of anything, then you'll be like, well, why would you ever lie? Because you can't actually be certain that lying is going to improve your situation, right? Like, or that like an affair is going to improve your situation. So it's kind of funny. The other thing that actually happens in vice is it makes you forget everything you know, actually, to do the vice. And then after you do the vice, you remember everything, but now you've kind of gone over the edge. So it's a weight on you, which then can make you do more vice, more vice, more voice. And it becomes kind of a self-feeding problem. And that's definitely what occurs. And again, it's hard for us to think this, though, if we only think about good and bad in terms of measurable results. I definitely think we're under a kind of tyranny of the model. If you can't model it or quantify it, then it's not real. And one of the reasons, frankly, that virtue tends to become mere morality. Now, again, I'm not going to claim I'll never use morality with virtue. Language is hard, right? But in this conversation, one of the reasons why virtue gets conflated with morality is because morality is quantifiable. Virtue is not. And if the only real things are quantifiable, then there's no difference between virtue and morality. There's only one kind of good, the quantifiable good. And so as a result, virtue just becomes a simile. It doesn't refer to any territory that is unique from what the word morality is specifying. The funny thing is, the more particular something is, the more particular a thing is, arguably the more real it is. Like, there's only a particular apple. There is no general apple, right? Like, there's just that apple. And yet the more particular a thing is, the more difficult it is to model. So there's a mismatch here. Like, you can't make a model that's modeling every particular apple on planet Earth. The model would be incomprehensibly large and useless, right? It's a model finds a middle zone between wrong and useful, as we'll talk about in computer science, right? Like, George Box has that idea that all models are wrong, but some are useful, in the sense of, if you have a perfect model, then why not just have the apple? Why not just have the thing? You don't need a perfect model. But then if the model is too wrong, you can't use it. So you have to find a middle ground, right? So all models work by finding a sweet spot between general and particular, abstract and concrete, right? So by definition, all models remove you from reality to some degree. That's why they work. So if you treat the model, though, as most real, you are saying most real is a state removed from reality to some degree. To what degree can vary, but it must be removed. And the more particular a thing is, well, the more you actually encounter it, the more you would have to be there to get it, the more that you are the only one there to make a decision relative to it, the more and more you, according to your discernment, can decide what is appropriate. So the more and more it's going to be really important for you to have some mental models, or dare I say virtues, by which you can go about that particular situation. And yet, if we've conflated virtue and morality, then we probably don't have the skills and abilities to deal with our particular situations, because particular situations apparently don't exist, because the only things that exist are general modelable situations. So if you think you're in a particular situation that can't be modeled, you must be deluded, because we've all learned that the only real things are models and quantifiable. Of course, none of this is true, but this is how we act in moral life, actually. Like, this is literally how we act. Because we only have morality and not virtue, we have to treat all particular situations as if they are only ethically consequential to the degree that they can be universalized or generalized and thus removed from reality. And therefore, ethics cannot contribute to us contacting reality. Ethics actually removes us now from reality, because it is modeled in terms of morality at the exclusion of virtue, and therefore the ethical life, or the good life, is a life that is a step removed from reality. So then why bother? Why even care about these topics if they just make you abstract or not seem to have any relevance? And so we then forego the good life, figuring out the good, to a systems analysis, that if we do that, we will not have the resources by which to meet or respond to particular situations. And you see, since virtue cannot be measured, though, it's a kind of vulnerable thing to do. It's one of the reasons why we give up virtue for morality, because if virtue is your internal resources in a particular situation, for you to make a decision that you will then be responsible for, well, that's existentially terrifying. Let's just do utilitarianism. That's what ends up happening, right? Because virtue is going to bring together decisions of what you think are the right ordering, the right things to do, that you are responsible for, that you're not. Here's the key. Since you cannot model it, you can't blame a model. If you could model it and everything went to crap, you could say, well, the model told me to, so it's not your fault. But if you can't model it, it's your fault then. One of the reasons we like utilitarianism is because if it fails, it's not our fault. We were just following the analysis. We were just doing what the data said. It said it would reduce poverty. Well, actually, it turned out a lot of the aid programs from the World Bank, as George Stiglitz will talk about in Globalization, its discontents blew up. It looks like these aid programs actually didn't get to the people. They just strengthened the corrupt government. Well, we were just doing what we thought was right. We did our analysis, and the model said that we should do these aid programs. You got Demisa Moya, who's critical of foreign aid programs. They don't send all these utilitarian programs, but it's not our fault. We were just trying to do the right thing. Models give you space for denying responsibility. You can always say it was the model's fault. The model made me do it. The model made me do it. So we love utilitarianism because we can tell ourselves we're good people because we follow the model. And if the model screws up, it's not our fault. So no matter what goes down, we can tell ourselves we're good people because we're following the system and we're following the utilitarian analysis. But if you do virtue, you don't have a model. You have your own discernment and your own choices. And that would mean to do the right thing, you must suffer the real and Lacanian sense of getting it wrong. And you must suffer existential anxiety. So these are some of the reasons why we've conflated virtue and morality to escape responsibility for the good life in a manner that we can plausibly convince ourselves we're still good people because we're just doing what the system said. And the system follows a utilitarian analysis. So if it makes things worse, it's not our fault. And so we're great. We're good people. So it's all part of the psychological gymnastics that humans carry out to tell themselves they're good people and sleep at night and to feel like they're doing the right thing when really they're actually finding a way to avoid having to deal with the tensions and decisions of virtue that if you had to face, you would be responsible for. And here's the thing, even if you get it right, even if you make a right decision, because it can't be quantified, no one may appreciate it. No one may ever get that you did a good thing. But if you were to reduce poverty by 3% following this model, oh my gosh, you're such a good person. You did so many good things. So virtue has you alone. You're alone with what you're doing as right and good. And you may be the only person who ever knows that you did what was right and good. But that's what virtue would call on you. And it would call you to actually dedicate your life to spending a whole lot of time at getting good at something that no one will know you're good at. Only you could know you're good at it. And that's a very naked and vulnerable life, but that's what's required of virtue, I think.
Yeah, I feel the weight of that as you're speaking. I feel the magnitude of what it is that you're sharing and what it is that it's being asked of the individual. Yeah, it feels like the overlap between, there's a couple threads I want to pull on here. The overlap between let me see if I can elucidate this. The suffering that comes from virtue, or the pain that comes from doing something that is virtuous, as the I'm getting a sense of like humility and selflessness in this, in that, you know, to, like you said, to raise poverty by 3%, there's a level of validation or approval from others that strokes the ego and tends to, it feels like, increase selfishness or like pride or aggrandizement of self in some way. And then to do the virtuous thing that no one knows about is sort of, I heard once someone define love as to do something that is good and not need anyone to know about, for no one to know about it. Like, to, I don't know, the example was like, I don't know, send $100 to someone in the mail and don't put a name on it so they don't know who it is, and don't put any way of them, just like, or just like, yeah, doing some sort of act of kindness without like someone being able to approve or validate you for doing that good thing, that kind act. Um, and yeah, it's, I would love to explore this tension that you started putting forth here even more, because it feels really fruitful and valuable. The You started talking about the existential anxiety that comes from taking responsibility, being in a particular context, having no framework that's telling me what the right decision is, sensing, and it also alludes to the fact that each situation and context is in some ways infinite. There's in I can't reduce the context that I'm in to sets of variables that I can analyze and figure out what is right. But actually there's just like this infinite amount of complexity and interdependence. And it really makes me think of Nora Bateson's work. And she talks about the interdependence of systems, and how true interdependence in systems thinking is essentially being with the context fully in some sort of non-conceptual way, or like not trying to overlay conceptual frameworks onto something that is infinitely complex. And it just has me sense that, yeah, the pain of discerning, this is what I was getting from what you were saying, if I may summarize it, is the pain of being in a context that is very individual and unique, and discerning what is the right decision based on no support from the outside, and trying to do good, and then sometimes amidst that process making bad decisions and having to take responsibility for the fact that we did something that was perhaps, I don't know if you would say wrong or bad, but something that leads to less vitality in myself and others. And then having to sit with that, and sit with the fact that I may not be as good of a person as I thought I was, and the pain of that, and then continuing to move forward to try to do good, despite knowing that I made a decision that was in some senses bad or not virtuous, based on my own discernment, and that being a very painful process, but one that is ultimately more real and more in touch with reality and truth than perhaps going the utilitarian route and feeling good about myself in a deluded, self-deceived way and wanting other people to pat me on the back for the things that I'm doing.
That's all gold. I mean, again, I think the great Forrest Landry, when he's emphasizing decision making, there's an emphasis on not, well, we use models to avoid decisions, right? We say, you know, we don't have to make a decision. We just follow, like, you just follow the model. That's not really a decision. You're just doing what you were told, really. And that's why, and I think Nora Bates is wonderful on this. I think all of these temptations to say, well, I was talking with Cadell Last and Andrew Sweeney on this distinction between planning and prepared. And based on Ivan Illich, and what we try to do is plan the future so we don't have to be prepared for it. Because if we know everything that's going to happen in the future, if we have it all planned, there's no need to be prepared, because we're going to plan in such a way that nothing bad happens, really. And you can see utilitarianism, when it's overfit, as a way to plan so we don't have to be prepared. Let's put it this way. When you're dealing with problems that can indeed be planned away, you're dealing with, because you're going to make plans. I'm not saying plans are bad. It's all about the overfitting, like we said at the beginning, the wrong order, overfitting, over applying a tool. It's not right or wrong. It's all about like cooking. Everything is about like the right ingredients in the right way. I have to plan to go to the venue and unfold chairs, right? But the funny thing is that planning tends to work for the immediate, not the long term, because the long term is too complex. And yet we tend to do the exact opposite. We tend to make plans for the long term and have no idea what we're going to do today. And so it's like we get it completely backwards. When really what we got to do is planning is on the side of utilitarianism, where being prepared is virtue ethics, if we use kind of the Aristotelian idea, right? Prepared is when you don't know what's going to happen, but you're ready for it no matter what it might be. Right? Like, to use Nassim Taleb again, like, I don't know when the rock is going to hit the window. It could be any time. I can't plan for that, but I can design the window in such a way that when the rock hits it, it doesn't break. I'm prepared for whenever the rock may hit, even if I can't plan for when it's going to occur, right? So another way to look at this is that as we move from the general to the particular, you move from what can be planned to what cannot be planned. So you have to move from plan to preparation. And virtue is all about preparation for the unexpected, for the unknown. But one of the big things of preparation is being able to handle existential uncertainty, because the particular places where you make a virtuous decision are going to be terrifying or difficult, right? So you actually have to deal with, like, you got to do whatever training you got to do to be like emotionally ready for spaces of just individual decision making, because they're going to be difficult. So existential preparedness, if you want to say, would be a part of this equation, because if you're not existentially prepared, you likely will not be able to make a decision that requires something existential of you. You see what I'm saying? The other reason why, and let me, to just kind of clarify what I'm saying about utilitarianism. Utilitarianism is a adequate ethical framework when dealing with third world nations, or when you're dealing with poverty. Okay, when you look at a room and people don't have food, you can make a pretty fair analysis that what we need is food here, right? Because people are starving, okay? Here's the problem. As you move from, say, third world to first world, the utilitarian analysis will not give you enough information. Like, if I look at a room where everyone has food, everyone's clothed, everyone's basically okay, what is utilitarianism going to tell you? Nothing. And yet, we know all the time when people gather at Thanksgiving and it turns into a drama fest. We know all the time when people don't know how to interact in those situations and it causes trouble, right? So as you move from a third world nation to a first world nation, you must move from utilitarianism to virtue ethics, because you move from situations that are generalizable to situations that are always much more particular. Because when it comes to, say, what to do at Thanksgiving, your particular family with your particular personalities are going to be very different from, say, another family at Thanksgiving or something like that, right? But when you're dealing with, say, food, or everyone in this country is lacking food, well, you don't need to know the difference in personality types or interests to say, well, let's give them food. Now, funny enough, I would actually argue that many utilitarian analyses that is trying to help third world nations from, say, when giving her, so there's that book on giving her, a lot of the foreign aid actually doesn't even work. So so a lot of times when they're ineffective, they're economically not well implemented. You can give people money, but if they don't have rule of law, it gets broken down. If the government's corrupt, so here's the thing, often utilitarian analysis, even if they're more valid when dealing with third world nations, they should not assume that the conditions are there will say foreign aid is going to work, because you can get all sorts of unintentional consequences. Demisa Moya, the African economist, is very good on that. And you see that. But at least in that situation, the analysis is more likely to be accurate, even if the implementation does not work because of unintended variables like government corruption, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But here's the thing, once you get to first world nations, and of course in first world nations, there are degrees of poverty that a utilitarian analysis can help with. But the more first world a nation becomes, the more you're going to need virtue ethics, because the more and more the right thing to do is going to be really, really particular. And basically what America, if I just speak of America, we basically said, well, we don't need to worry about that. People will, if you make things comfortable, if you give people food and water, they'll make good decisions. That's basically been our philosophy. It's the philosophy of what I call autonomous freedom. If people have freedom, they'll figure it out, and there will be an emergent kind of positive result. Well, not even Adam Smith believed that. Adam Smith did not believe in the notion that freedom necessarily created value. I have that in a paper talking about Keynes and different people. And even someone like Friedrich Hayek was critical of the notion of laissez-faire capitalism. But I know we're talking about particular situations, but it's the idea that, well, it's not really our business to worry about training people in their own particular life circumstances. Well, that's when you get all the trauma. That's when you get all the mental health problems. We can see the mental health crisis as a result of people not having virtue training. Because if you don't know how to make decisions, well, then you end up hurting people's feelings on accident, and they hurt your feelings, and then there's anxiety everywhere all the time. Like, you could almost, you can basically, based on how we're defining virtue, say that as virtue falls, anxiety goes up, because people don't know how to make decisions or how to make choices or what to say or what to do in situations. So anxiety goes up. And what happens as anxiety goes up? Mental health gets worse. And so the other reason why understanding that utilitarianism is not the only game in town is because utilitarianism cannot help you reduce anxiety. It may help you reduce, say, starvation or a lack of fear, in the sense of we don't have security and the other tribe may invade us. But anxiety, as distinct from fear, that's not the business of utilitarianism. That's the business of virtue, which makes sense, because if virtue requires you to face existential situations, what are you doing? You're being trained in anxiety. You're being trained to deal with anxiety. If when you go to make a choice, you have to face the existential, you're getting used to anxiety. You're encountering daily dosage. You're getting familiar with anxiety. What's happening now is people are not doing regular training with anxiety, and then suddenly and all at once, they're hit with anxiety at Thanksgiving dinner one day. They're not ready for it. It overwhelms them, and now they have a mental health problem, and now they don't want to deal with their family. Now they don't want to deal with people. Like, a way to look at this is virtue is existential preparing for the inevitable situations of anxiety you will run into, so that you are not destroyed by that anxiety or overwhelmed by that anxiety or, tackled by that anxiety, if you will. And so what you just see, it's like the rocketing the window. You don't know when you're going to get hit by anxiety. You don't know when the day is going to occur when you're in a family situation or a relational situation or a work situation where you get smacked across the face with Lacan's The Real with the anxiety. But because you've prepared for it through virtue training, as I'll just say, which entails existential training, you're ready for it. You're prepared for it. And so it does not disable you, as Ivan Illich would say. And so virtue is training in existentialism so that you're prepared for inevitable anxiety, which, funny enough, the more a nation becomes a first world nation, the more anxious situations it encounters, because the more it is dealing on personal, not how do we get water, how do we get food. Freud said that it was first world nations that need psychoanalysis, not really third world nations, because third world nations were very focused on like very clear problems, like how to get food, how to get water. So there wasn't as the personal dynamics. It's almost like they had an external variable to deal with those personal differences, because we got to get along to figure out how to take care of the field, right? But as you become a first world nation, there's way more relational. People's everyday life is not about basic survival. It's far more about interacting with people, right? Unless you're isolationist or something. Well, guess what? The more you're interacting with people, the more you're in the realm of anxiety. You're in the realm of encountering anxiety. So existential prep work through virtue becomes being prepared for that anxiety. So when it hits, it doesn't overwhelm you. So virtue becomes incredibly important in first world nations. And yet, funny enough, a first world nation seems to be when you don't need virtue. Because look, we're comfortable. Things are good. We don't need to worry about virtue. Everything's fine. Nope, it's the exact opposite. It's precisely where things seem comfortable that virtue becomes indispensable, because anxiety is inevitable.
I'm really appreciating this overlap between mental health issues and virtue that you're setting forth. It feels very on point to me. And it feels like I spend a lot of time in the sort of psychological mental health space, like people in that space trying to address these issues. And I don't often hear virtue and discerning what good decisions are and sitting with the pain of existential anxiety as something that relates to overcoming mental health issues. And it's more approached from a very individualistic lens of I'm just going to deal with my own stuff and I'm just going to, it doesn't seem to be as oriented towards, I don't think that's right, towards relationships. I don't think that's a true comment, but there was something, yeah, there was so many things here that were really interesting to me. And I always seem to have a million threads in my head as you're speaking, and then very few when it's my turn to speak. So um this notion of preparedness feels really, really intriguing to me. This notion of being essentially prepared so that when I am confronted by anxiety of needing to make a decision, a virtuous decision, I'm not completely overwhelmed and having a panic attack and being leveled to the ground by the intensity of the situation, but I've prepared my psyche and my being enough such that I have the resources to face it. And the question that comes up for me is what does that look like? What does it look like to engage daily in preparing for that? And I have the sense that we spoke it before we started recording on the importance of responsibility, the importance of taking responsibility in one's life in order to find meaning in the suffering of the world, which seems very much what we're talking about, that there's a lot of suffering involved with sitting with the existential anxiety of the decisions that we must make and not knowing whether a decision is right or wrong. And there's a certain inner conflict in that. And the I guess what I want to bring up is this sense that taking a proactive stance towards life and a sort of offensive stance towards life feels to me like the way to prepare for existential anxiety. And if I just sit back and, like you said, oh, the first world country, we're kind of comfortable, we don't really need to do much, let me just relax, watch some Netflix, hang out with some friends, smoke some weed, then when it does hit, I'm going to be leveled by it because I'm taking a reactive stance towards life rather than a proactive. And so taking a proactive stance towards life, this overlaps with one of the last conversations we talked about, which was self-limitations generate meaning or something along those lines. And why we must impose limitations on ourselves and the importance of that. And that bringing that into this conversation, it feels to me like I was reading some Eric Fromm yesterday, and he was talking. He has a book called The Art of Loving, and he was essentially saying that we have completely rejected discipline in the modern world. And he was essentially saying the fact that you go to a 9 to 5 job that you don't like is not discipline. He says that he says you're doing that because you feel like you have to, and then for most people's lives, they get off the job and then they completely reject discipline and turn into hedonism. And so he's like, that is not discipline because you're just showing up at an office every day. It's just like doing something because it feels like the only way to survive, essentially. And rather, what we need is to actually, take this more proactive stance towards life. Jordan Peterson talks about this a lot, just taking, he calls it like bearing the toughest weight that I could possibly bear every single day, which is essentially like when I'm not confronted with difficult choices that bring up intense existential anxiety, I must choose to put myself into limitations that cause me to suffer in service of training myself in building the capacities that I need to in order to respond to them when they do come. And essentially, to bring things full circle again, the 100-day program that we're running, that's essentially the idea behind it, is training the capacities in the individual to respond to something greater in the collective or in the relationships when they happen. It's like preparing for something that hasn't happened yet. And we're approaching that through doing things like cold shower, daily meditation, daily physical training, daily study and reflection on virtues. Something that I've been sitting with a lot is the importance of like daily intense reading and intense reflection, and conversations like these I would see as training, and writing is training and reflecting on these things. And then like in the challenge we added this thing called the integrity audit, which is every night, was I honest with myself and was I honest with others? Can I find any places where I'm out of integrity and correct them? Because the sense is, if I do that, that is virtue essentially. And it's like virtue training each day in little micro hits of like 5 minutes of reflection on integrity each night. And so I'm curious to hear where you stand on what does this preparedness look like? Because I imagine for you, it lands not quite the same as for me, or you're gonna have a different perception of what it looks like to prepare in this way. And so in your life, what does it look like to prepare for virtue? And yeah, I'm complete there.
Excellent. Well, first off, everything you said, I would agree, is absolutely in the business of virtue cultivation. I think writing conversations, looking back on your day and says, was I virtuous today? These are things that are absolutely in the business of virtue creation. And one of the reasons they are, funny enough, is because it's training that you can't even be sure is actually training. And what I mean by that is, if you went to the gym and you were to say, do some bench press for a bit, no one would deny, oh man, he's exercising. He's doing something that's good for his health, right? No one would deny that. Maybe some people would say there were different exercises you could do at different things, but it would be pretty well agreed that that was a useful exercise. Well, when you talk about writing, I would say probably most people would say, why are you doing that, actually? Like, are you planning to be a published writer? Why would you even bother, right? That means it's existential prep work. Training that you're training that there's a little voice in your training that involves a little voice in your head whispering this isn't training is precisely existential prep work. In that way, some of the most valuable training, precisely because you are doing something that you can't justify as getting you a job, justifying you as getting paid. You cannot easily justify it. This is one of the most important ways to engage in existential preparation, to avoid temptations of justifying yourself. Now, one of the reasons why virtue ethics is particular and difficult is because there actually are times when you should justify what you're doing. But then there are other times when you can't justify what you're doing because they would have to be you to get it. This is what's tricky. The more you move into particular situations, it's that you can't justify it. Like if you can justify what you're doing, and arguably should, then by all means. Maybe it's on a job site where people are like, why did you park the truck there? We have to load boxes in it. Well, the reason I did is because actually another truck has to come in first. Oh, okay. So you're justifying what you're doing, but you're doing it in the context of where you should justify it because people have to make decisions around your decisions, right? But as you move to your own particular life, you'll find that a lot of the things that you know are actually preparing you for anxiety or preparing you for life are things that other people are like, what are you doing? That's silly. You're not getting paid. Well, that's precisely why it's existential prep work. And the funny thing is, precisely the things that objectively seem like you shouldn't do are the things that then collectively people will be incentivized not to do, which will greatly contribute to the probability that the majority of people are leveled by anxiety. This is where social pressures are a big deal, and Ivan Illich was very good on that, but I'll hold. Jordan Peterson, he's often made fun of for the whole making the bed thing, and I actually think what people don't appreciate is how many people exist on this planet where making their bed is a huge, huge step because of the trauma they've been through, right? So that needs to be appreciated. Furthermore, again, I want to stress, there are places for utilitarian analysis. There is place for models and quantification. Nobody is saying that there's not. The issue is always overfitting. It is always over-applying. The danger of utilitarianism is precisely that it can provide a useful analysis, and precisely in being useful, you're tempted to do it everywhere. And it's also tempting to do it everywhere because you get credit from the collective, and that makes you feel good. And now something that may have started good as a genuinely and actually good as a utilitarian analysis with time then becomes egotistical and overfit. And that's where what would you need? Discernment, individual, like paying attention to how you're using the model to see if your motives are good. But here's the problem. If you've used the model for so many years, you've probably trained yourself out of that very discernment. And that's always the risk, right? Like a model, you should only use a model if you're able to discern when you're underfitting and overfitting it, when you're fitting it properly. But the very use of a model can get you into habits of not exercising that skill. And so with time, the likelihood of you doing that properly with the model goes down. Well, that means you better what? In your free time, be doing practices that are training your discernment outside of the model use. But if everyone in their free time is just watching movies or whatever, then they're not getting that training. The only training they're getting is on the job site. And the job site is where you use the model and get in the habits of not discerning if it's fitting. And therefore, it's just very probable you're going to overfitting. People are what they do in their free time, not what they do in their employment. And that's what Eric Fromm is getting at. And I think it's very nice to think that if you do a 9 to 5, you're disciplined, because if that's not discipline, then what is discipline? Oh, crap. Now you have to think for yourself in philosophy, and that's very confusing. Also, if a 9 to 5, if everyone thinks that's discipline, then you can be seen as disciplined, right? But if discipline is actually found in the non-quantifiable actions of training that may not be training or has that possibility, then you can't easily be seen as disciplined by other people. Therefore, the incentive to call the 9 to 5 or the stuff you have to do as discipline, because then it's easier to see yourself as disciplined because it's easier for other people to see you as disciplined. Not if you say, go into your room and close the door behind you, like Jesus says with prayer or different things like that, right? So there are all these psychological and existential reasons why we make these mistakes, because these mistakes are advantageous to our ego. The mistake of calling a 9 to 5 discipline is advantageous to our ego. That's why we do it. It's very important. It's not because we were, say, stupid. It's because we were emotionally led to that conflation so that we could then avoid the existential prep. And here's the irony. We've done these things to avoid anxiety, which has therefore made us unprepared for anxiety. Like all of these mistakes are a result of avoiding the existential feelings you get from doing stuff for yourself, for example. So you don't do them because you don't like the feeling of anxiety. Well, that means when anxiety hits, it levels you. You see what I'm saying, right? So it's a very dire mistake. And the thing I wanted to say on the making of the bed is it's very true that making your bed every morning is a way to practice responsibility and to get good at doing these kind of practices. But the existential prep are going to be non-quantifiable acts. If someone comes into your bedroom, everyone can see you made your bed, and everyone can say, oh, it's better to have a made bed than not. Generally, maybe that one guy's like, nah, man, messy beds are good. But generally, most people would say, oh, this is good. You've done a good thing. What I would simply say is that the existential prep, or the virtue preparation, or the virtue responsibility we're talking about, is where you start doing daily activities that are not quantifiable as easily as making your bed. Like, say, writing, where people think you're crazy, or like, say, doing the 100-day exercise. Why would you do that? You don't need to do that. Why would you even be doing? Because you know you need to. Well, you don't. You're not getting paid, right? No, the very fact that you're doing something that seems crazy is precisely why it is such a necessary training, right? Because it is making you capable of being capable. Like, if you're able to do things for yourself by your own values, that means you're what? Capable. If you're reliant on the system telling you that this is important or you should do this, you're actually not capable. You're disabled. You're reliant on the system bestowing upon you your direction. I'll talk about Nietzsche as a critique of bestocentrism. I'm happy to go into that, but he's like, for Nietzsche, life is about learning how to not rely on your life being bestowed to you, your direction, right? There's going to be some degree of bestowing, as there's going to, of course, be degrees of planning, but you want to get them in the right order. You don't want to be reliant on it. So it's very, very important for you to be capable of being capable, and that's going to be a product of doing little acts that are not quantifiable, that actually engage in existential preparation, that if you don't do, you will lack virtue training to keep anxiety from leveling you. So let me make an example. All right, you're in so these are the little things that I do to your question that I actually think are a big deal. We've all been in a conversation where somebody says something that suggests you did something wrong, and you feel the temptation to say, well, I only did it because Sarah told me, right? You want to give a reason for why you did that thing. Resist that urge. Resist that urge and stand there naked. No one will know that actually it was Sarah's fault. No one will ever know that you resisted the temptation to say, well, I only did it because I was tired. I only did it because Sarah told me to. Well, I thought it was the right thing. No one will ever know that everything inside of you wanted to defend yourself and to say that little comment. No one will ever know. But those are the practices that direct you toward virtue. We've all had the phone call that we didn't want to make. We've all had the phone call that we wanted to push off for a day or two. No one will ever know how difficult it was for you to make that call today. When you pick it up at 4 and you call that person that you really didn't want to call, no one will ever know how difficult that was for you. But you'll know. If you pushed it off 2 days, you could always say, oh, I was busy. Oh, I forgot about it. You could always make an excuse. You know, if you call that person at 4 o'clock, you are choosing not to give those excuses. You are choosing not to justify delays. You are doing something very difficult, but no one will ever know. It's not like making your bed. You know that you faced that anxiety and you pushed into it and you went along with it, but no one else, no one will ever know. And no one will even appreciate the fact that you did that because they don't know the difficulty you went through, but you'll know it. When you get up in the morning and you do that writing exercise, no one will know that the night before you dealt with 2 hours of telling yourself, this is stupid. Why am I even doing that? No one will. In fact, the next day people will say, they may look at you and say, oh yeah, you were just selfishly indulging in your own joy of writing. You're not ever thinking about other people. You're just doing what you like to do. They may never know. In fact, they may think they see clear evidence that you don't care about other people because instead of hanging out with other people, you're writing. So they'll think they see a lot of evidence that you're actually in vice, and actually they need to help you because look at you. You're spending all this time doing these writing projects or journaling or doing this training instead of hanging out with people. And don't people matter? Virtue is the realm where people can spin narratives that put you in vice. That's why we don't like virtue. Virtue is the realm where people can create narratives that plausibly interpret your actions as wrong. That's precisely why it develops existential prepping. It entails existential prepping and why it entails character. You don't need character. You really don't need character unless you're in a place where people can spin narratives against you that makes you viceful. It is the possibility of people interpreting what you're doing as stupid, irrational, waste of time, and even viceful, even wrong, even selfish. That's where character comes in. That's where virtue comes in. And that's where you have to stand and know that, no, actually, there was a very long battle that went into the possibility of doing this thing that I'm going to stick to, that no one but you may ever know. But that is the kind of thing that people have to do if they don't want anxiety to level them. But it is very difficult. But it is a difficulty that must be faced.
Yeah, I got chills when you were speaking. Especially the part about other people seeing it as vice and only you knowing. Feels very, very pertinent. And I notice in myself the amount of resistance and anxiety I've felt in doing things that I've got no credit for. And then it's like, well, why did I do that thing? It was so freaking hard. I could have just not done it. Or maybe that, and before I do it, that's what's happening in my mind. Yeah, it feels very, very relevant. I'm seeing this, and I'm gonna hop off at 15 minutes, so we'll have about 15 minutes left. The last thing I wanted to cover was in the domain of relationships and how we're relating with other people. Yeah, there's, I guess, a couple threads here. You talk about, all right, if I'm going to choose to be by myself doing the things that is prepping me for anxiety, for existential anxiety, a lot of times I'm not to say no to just hanging out with people. And then contradictory to that, orienting my life towards valuing relationships and experiencing love and care for people, even when I disagree with them, also feels like a very virtuous thing to do, as we spoke about before the podcast. And so, and I imagine that it's individual discernment here that it comes down to, because to know when it is that I'm serving a relationship from a place of virtue or from a place of avoiding a virtuous thing that I don't want to do, such as writing and reflecting on my motives and so on and so forth. Yeah, that was one of the things that was coming up for me. It was like introspection and just sitting down and pulling out a piece of paper and asking, what are my motives and from which place did I act from today? Feels like a very virtuous thing that to do that no one will ever know about. And but back to the main question or the main inquiry, what is it, how does it land for you in making decisions around virtue that no one will know about, and also valuing relationships in a way that, because I sense that there's a trap here where I can tell myself that I'm doing the virtuous thing by staying inside and writing all day, while also having that be in service of utilitarian outcomes of serving an organization that I'm building or trying to build a nonprofit that helps the world, and then in turn putting all of my relationships by the wayside. And so I have a sense that, yes, it's important to show up for virtuous things in isolation, and also, and I have this sense, and I'm curious if this is how it lands for you, of when I'm in relationship, there's also things, I think you were already speaking on this, that I can relate virtuously to people, and I can withhold things that my defensive, reactive, egoic self wants to say in service of supporting a relationship or supporting, and that can also be virtuous, and no one will ever know about the the prideful, aggrandizing comment that I wanted to make but that I didn't. And so how does that fit into this? And the last thing I'll add is, we talked about family values a little bit, and how does that fit in as well, of just, yeah, loyalty to family feels like somehow it could fit in, and I'm not quite sure how. And I have a sense you may have some threads connecting those. So yeah, take it away.
Well, you're very kind, Mr. Ethan Nelson. I always appreciate the chance to speak with you, so thank you for the opportunity. It should also be noted that when we talk about virtue and virtue ethics, and we talk about Aristotle a lot, Aristotle's ethics, Aristotle was probably mostly teaching to people in first world nation or richer class, right? So, when we think about that, it can help to understand why virtue ethics seems to have something more to do with first world nations. And so, again, though, it's difficult for us to see that because we've been so kind of captured by a utilitarian monoculture, like a monoethic, the only kind of ethic. So that should be noted. As first world nations develop, what you get is more particularization, right? Because you can't just say, oh, everyone needs food. You start saying, well, Sarah needs a friend, Bob needs someone to help with the shed. Everything particularizes, right? Where there's particularization, there's difference. And where there is difference, there is diversity. And basically, diversity without virtue is impossible. What ends up happening is the more difference comes out, the more people become particular people because their basic needs are taken care of, and so they particularize. Well, virtue is the handling of difference. That's why it's all about anxiety, because where does anxiety arise? Between different people. You don't have anxiety when everyone's similar. You don't have anxiety when everyone has similar beliefs and they think the same way and it's like fascism or something, right? Anxiety emerges with difference. And what we've tried to do that's gotten us into a lot of trouble in first world nations is we've tried to do diversity without virtue. We've tried to do diversity with simply utilitarian frameworks, but utilitarian frameworks work by definition by removing diversity. So you get this mixed thing where you're treating everyone as flat characters while simultaneously praising diversity. So you get this pathological thing and nobody's happy, really. Like we need virtue to actually love and enjoy difference and handle difference in a way that brings out its beauty, right? Because beauty is not possible without difference. Beauty is a result of a concert of different variables existing in a harmony that brings something out that's irreducible to an individual parts. So diversity is hard, but it is the precondition of beauty, and that beauty is possible according to virtuous action. If we engage in virtue, we know how to interact with difference in a manner where we are not overwhelmed with anxiety, because most of the time, the reason you get xenophobia, racism, or these terrible reactions to diversity is because people have not done the existential prep work. They are encountering someone that believes something different from them, and they have never in their life done existential prep work. So they're made anxious because suddenly it turns out to them that not everyone on planet Earth is a Christian. And it turns out that actually atheists can be nice people too. Oh my gosh, that isn't what my mom told me. This person's evil. And you back out, right? So without existential prep work, people can't handle encountering difference. And you get this. So the stuff we're saying about existential prep work applies to, if you don't do it, you have anxiety. Anxiety levels you. Racism takes over, xenophobia takes over, all of these terrible things that are spreading around the world, they take over where people aren't doing the existential prep work. But of course, why should they do the existential prep work? Because they're never going to get any credit if they do it. No one will ever acknowledge them. And in fact, people will see them as viceful maybe, or wasting their life, or not caring about others. So what's very important is without virtue, you can't have relationships that are diverse. You can only have relationships with people like you. And in fact, without the existential prep work, things like fascism, totalitarianism, close-mindedness, those become the only kind of relationships that people can handle, actually. And so far from existential prep work and virtue work being at the expense of relationships, they are the possibility of relationships that are not tribal. We have to engage in this virtue work if we want relationships to not just be self-confirming, isolationist, and ultimately fascist. Ironically, though, people will then actually deconstruct or mock or get rid of the existential prep work and virtue work in the name of community and relationships, and in that way be an engine that is actually making fascism worse. Because it's all about order. And if you put second things first, the community before the existential prep work, you lose both. C.S. Lewis was right that first things must come first, and you'll get second things also. But You get them out of order, you get neither. So the explosion of the mental health problem, the mental health crises, xenophobia, racism, the return to nationalism, the breakdown of communities, the loss of social capital, the flight of people to people like them, all of these can be seen as the only possible outcome of relationships of a people that don't do existential prep work, ergo do not do the work of virtue, because it's irrational to do that work, because the only framework that's true is utilitarianism. So people don't even think about this kind of work to make them capable of engaging with diversity, ergo true pluralism, of which if we could engage with, we'd have more beauty. And so we can see, here's the thing. The truth is, the world is particular. Goodness is the capacity to relate to that particularity, which by definition is diverse, without being leveled by anxiety. And the result of being capable of that is beauty. So the existential prep work is the necessary link between good, true, and beautiful, that if you can hold those together, which would be an act of virtue, it becomes possible to have a beautiful community. Without this work, the only community will be tribes. You will not have community or relationships that are virtuous. The only way to have virtuous relationships would be doing the existential prep work. And so you couldn't have virtuous families either. What ends up happening is people who don't do this existential prep work, the children get to be basically forced to be like the parents. They are forced into conformity. They're made to feel guilty if they don't do baseball like their dad did. The parents expect them to be like that because the families must become fascist as well. And so the existential prep work is where if the parents do that work, they'll allow their children to be diverse from them. They'll allow their children to be their own kind of people. And the children will also be equipped, because they've seen their parents doing existential prep work, to know that existential prep work is not a waste of time and there's value in it, because that was the family culture. And so the family culture then can actually contribute to the children being themselves, but also valuing the culture. So they're not going to become diverse out of rebellion. A lot of children will become their own people, but from a place of rebellion. No, we want to become our own people from a place of unfolding, which is difference, but in a manner that honors the home, right? We don't want people to be different. Most difference today from the family, unfortunately, is a product of rebellion. We want difference to emerge out of the family from an unfolding of a center of which did the existential prep work to handle the unfolding of that difference. But that would require the parents to do it. But that actually is just a model of what everyone should do in all of their relationships with friends and community and all of these different things. It all just becomes isomorphic, sharing in models with one another to one another. Now, to the question of when you should say, am I writing too much? Am I hanging out with people too much? Well, this is where you have to, even in the act of typing on the keyboard or writing with the pen, you're actually engaged in reflecting on yourself. When you're writing, ask yourself, am I writing because I don't want to do that phone call? When you're on the phone, ask yourself, am I on the phone because I'm trying to avoid that writing? You must develop that still small voice within you that is able to actually sense why you are doing the thing that you are doing, which of course is a product of existential preparation. The very still small voice. And here's the thing. What if the still small voice is crazy? What if it's telling you the wrong thing? What if you're actually brainwashed? That's the risk that's necessary for it to be part of the existential preparation. The very fact that that little voice is something you can always doubt is precisely why listening to it and paying attention to it is in fact an act of existential preparation that existential preparation makes possible. And so it's all then within the same act that you alone have to make the decisions to commit to and live according to. And other people might think you're crazy, but if they don't think you're crazy, then you're probably not doing the things needed so you can engage with true diversity, have a family that enables unfolding and contributes to a world that's unfolding as opposed to going to tribal warfare. And so those risks all up and down the chart, of which we have rationally avoided, because why would you take on risk when you can be comfortable? Well, what you fear is what comes unto you. And if you're afraid of risk, then you take quite a large risk. And that's a large risk of the world falling into tribalism, fascism, anxiety, mental health. In the name of avoiding difficulty, we've made things very difficult. And it would be very, very wise if we were to simply engage in the existential preparation that would make us prepared for a world of which people prove capable to be the link, thanks to that existential preparation, to bring together the true, the beauty, and the good, so that we can know a kind of life together that is not one that is afraid, because the one who fears is not made perfect in love. You're muted, my friend.
I said mic drop. That was an incredible ending to this podcast. Yeah, that was amazing. I'm definitely going to re-listen to that last part because felt like you just tied a bow on the entirety of the conversation in the most flawless way possible. I really enjoyed the part of when I'm writing to ask myself, am I writing because I'm avoiding something else? Or if I'm on the phone, am I on the phone because I'm avoiding something else? And just consistently contemplating why it is I'm actually doing this, and if I'm actually doing the hard thing or if I'm not, and deeply resonate with, in the name of avoiding difficulty, we've made things very difficult. Feels very apt and very much in line with my orientation towards life these days of what is the most difficult load I can bear and the most difficult internal experience I can bear in service of potentially a world that is not informed by my own avoidance of pain. And so, yeah, thank you so much for joining me on the podcast. It is such a blessing, such a gift to speak with you. And yeah, just feeling a lot of deep reverence for whatever unfolds in these dialogues and how it shapes both of us. I was listening to some John Vervaeke yesterday, and he was talking about something that feels like it helps me contextualize what just happened. Was he talks about Plato as being sacred, and he says the reason Plato is sacred is because he reads Plato and it informs him, and then he goes out in the world and acts differently in the world, which then informs how he rereads Plato, which then, and it's just this reciprocal cycle. And I have a sense right now that that is what is happening, that our conversations are somehow shaping us in some way that is going to change. I feel viscerally that it's going to change how I'm showing up in the world. And then I'm going to come back to reading in these conversations in the future from a different place. And so I'm deeply grateful for that. So thank you.
I always look forward to speaking with you, Ethan Nelson. I feel the exact same way. It is an honor and a pleasure. And I really, really respect and think highly of the work that you are doing, because it is important, and it's what people, well, it engages in that sacredness. It changes how people act, which then changes the way they're in the world, which then changes how they are, which changes how they show up. Changing how we show up, that is quite an important work. It's very difficult to imagine more truth, goodness, and beauty in the world if people don't change how they show up. So the work that you're doing to so condition and help people in that fashion is very, very admirable. And it is a pleasure to know you and to speak with you. Thank you, Ethan Nelson.